I am ready to jump into this week's content, which is schedule nerd stuff. Okay, so let's talk about the big dates. The Denver Nuggets have their season opener, which is the first big day of the NBA regular season schedule anyway, on October 24th versus Oklahoma City. That is a really important game because it is versus a division rival. Obviously, it's the first game of the season. It's at home. You want to set the tone. It's a game where Christian Braun, probably moving into the starting lineup, is going to face his first real test as our main guard and wing defender at the point of attack versus Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who finished second in MVP voting last year. Will, what do you think about this game, about this matchup coming on the first night of the season?
Opening games are interesting because you kind of lack context of the regular season leading up to it. You're fresh,
Right.
everyone's
You have
excited
no
to
idea
play.
how other teams are playing, how you're playing, how
Yeah.
everyone's going to feel. Hmm.
All we know is that the Nuggets are one of the better teams and the Thunder are one of the better teams in the West for sure. So I like the matchup. I don't know how much I'm going to take away from this other than general impressions of how the Nuggets roster looks and maybe some rotation pieces. I think people are going to be looking a lot towards the young players and how much playing time they're getting and what the rotations are. This might be different because Malone might see this as a more competitive game because it's the Thunder, and maybe those young guys may not get the similar rotations they would get in the rest of the regular season in this game because he did that even last season. Who knows? Maybe he learned his lesson from last season. And he's like, regardless of the matchup or the moment or the stakes, I actually need to play these guys regardless, and I need to be more strict with the minutes and less beholden to the idea of like taking out a top contender in this game. I don't know necessarily how Malone views those big matchups like with contenders as far as like
Mm,
we need to win this game because
yeah.
it's an important team. So,
Yeah, I think that they're going to take this game seriously. Like when you're talking about, pacing guys and trying to, make sure that, yeah, like I said, guys aren't playing too much or, whatever it is. I don't think that that's a worry so much in the first half of the schedule. Like, we're going to talk about this with the structure of the Nuggets schedule, but this year in particular, it's going to be pretty important for them to hit the ground running, and they usually do. Like, they're a team that usually starts off the year really well, kind of start to build a cushion, and then slog through the sloggier parts of the season. But as for the matchup itself, I think Malone absolutely cares that it's OKC, that they're not just a division rival, but the favorites to come out of the Western Conference, if you ask basically any national analyst right now, because they were the number one seed last year. They played Dallas pretty tough, even though they lost that series. And they have an MVP candidate in Shea, and they got better, right? They got Isaiah Hartenstein from the Knicks. I do think that that's going to be an impactful addition to the team, even if I'm not quite as high on their overall regular season as some others. And Alex Caruso in for Josh Giddey. It's interesting because, the Nuggets lost KCP, and Christian Braun's going to be stepping into that starting role if everything goes as we expect it to, right? Everyone's still projecting this idea of like, Malone's like, nobody has earned that starting spot yet. And Christian's like, I haven't earned that starting spot yet. Christian Brown's gonna be the starting shooting guard unless something crazy happens at training camp, right? I actually think that the loss of Josh Giddey is going to make a bigger impact on OKC, not overall, but I think they're going to take a little bit longer to adjust to that change than the Nuggets will losing KCP because he wasn't in like a playmaker role. Josh Giddey was like relatively important for at least anchoring some of say the non-Shea minutes, and even in SGA's minutes, he was this like important secondary ball handler. They don't really have that anymore unless you're counting Caruso as that. And even if you are, he's not the level of say playmaker that Josh Giddey is, right? Even though
yeah.
he brings shooting, he brings defense. Like it's just going to be a different team. Whereas OKC is usually predicated on a good amount of ball movement. And I think Josh Giddey was important to that, even if I don't think that he was like a good fit for that team long term. That's just something they're going to have to adjust to. The Nuggets have their own adjustments to make, particularly in say non-starter minutes, non-Jokic minutes, however you want to look at them, and we're going to see what those look like starting on, well, really in preseason, but for real, on this first regular season game versus OKC.
No, I mean, it's interesting points all around on the Thunder. We were missing a secondary kind of creator, ball handler last season. So that is a good point about Giddy,
Yeah,
because I think he is a good passer.
and
I don't,
connective.
yeah, I don't know like where I'd rank his playmaking specifically. I don't like watch him enough to really
Sure.
know.
I
But
think he was the best, easily the best passer on that team.
yeah, okay. So it'll be
Yeah.
just interesting to see if that does affect it. But I want to see the Jokic I Heart matchup. I want to see. I mean, we've seen it a little bit, against the Knicks last year, but it'll be interesting on this team. And then what else
I'm
on
interested to see
OKC?
how OKC uses Hardenstein, honestly. Like,
Yeah,
are they
that
going to
too.
start him? We've seen OKC in the past. Sometimes they adjust to their opponent, especially when they're facing, say, a size deficit like they would against a team like the Nuggets. But other times they lean all the way into their identity, which is small ball, Chet at the five, and then they would just play like Caruso in that spot. I'm curious to see what they do on night one. Uh, not just because it's what they would do against Denver, but they're also setting the tone for their season. So I'm curious to know, because I think that's their season opener as well, even though it's not at home. I'm curious to know what direction OKC is going to try to use as their baseline. So that'll be
Yeah.
another interesting question to watch with that game as well.
Yeah, I mean these West playoff teams maybe have more in their bag to bring out during a game. This is the opener, so I don't know how specific they're going to get with scheme versus just trying to like play the way they want to play and see how it goes.
Right.
We'll see. It'll be those kind of things are always interesting. Last season, I felt like we came out of the gate really well. Like the first 2 weeks, I think everyone was excited to play basketball again, coming off the championship, and I was really impressed with how we came out. And then quickly, the gas that we had was burned up, and then we had real highs and lows of the season.
So the other big date on the schedule is like an individual game is of course Christmas Day versus the Phoenix Suns. And a couple of people have pointed out, I think dating back to 2 seasons ago, whoever plays and beats the Suns on Christmas Day has won the Western Conference in the playoffs
Oh, that's
that
true.
year. Yeah, it was at least starting from the year the last Warriors title, and then the year after that, of course, the Nuggets beat the Suns on Christmas Day. We had the famous AG poster dunk over Landry Shamet in that overtime thriller. And last year, it was the Dallas Mavericks absolutely drubbing the Phoenix Suns, and then of course the Mavs won the Western Conference in the playoffs. So I think that game is important because I've already started seeing Suns fans online talking about how they want to break the curse or reverse the curse because they don't want to be the good luck Chuck team anymore. They obviously are a team that has title aspirations. So they think if they win their Christmas Day game versus Denver, that they can, get some vibes up, get the basketball karma back on their side, and
Yeah.
win the Western Conference. What do you think about that?
Yeah, we also have a game against them on the 23rd at home. So we will
That's
going
right.
from a home game against them straight to a road game against them. So I don't know how that'll affect the Christmas game specifically. Whether, let's say, we win that one, are we going to be less motivated to try to win again on the road? Because it's like we just beat them, then the Suns will be more motivated. Or will it be a flip of that scenario? Will it not matter because the Nuggets want to play really hard on Christmas regardless? Because the Christmas games always seem pretty exciting for
And
some
national
reason.
TV game as
Yeah.
well. Yeah, last year we had the Nuggets play the Warriors. It was at home on Christmas, and they had a more, prime time for Christmas Day is like middle of the day, but versus the Suns this year, it's going to be the late game, which is otherwise prime time. And on any other day, it would be prime time.
Maybe I would have been less excited about that Christmas matchup before the Kevin Durant stuff, but now there's gonna be some fireworks
True.
between the fans, and that Kevin Durant shit is gonna kick back up around then. I guarantee.
Oh
So
man, that's fun. Especially because it's going to be a home game and then a road game, not back to
yeah,
back, but in sequence like that. So
yeah.
we're going to
Nuggets
get
fans are gonna
lots of
boo
Kevin Durant. We're going to
KD.
talk about Kevin
Whew.
Durant a lot because he's an important player on that team on any given night. He's either the first or second best player on the Phoenix Suns. He was the I think, most important player that changed teams during that trade deadline 2 seasons ago, of course, right? Because he instantly turned the Phoenix Suns into a contender in everybody's eyes, and you can understand why. It's Kevin freaking Durant, right? But they have, underperformed since, or at least in the view of some. I think that they've performed exactly what they should for a team that traded away all their depth for three redundant superstars. And I don't even blame Kevin Durant for that. We
Yeah,
can get into it when we talk about everybody's off seasons, but it's more about the Beal deal for me. But yeah, it's Kevin Durant. The man has two finals MVPs. He's trying to get a third one, or at least contribute to another championship. And so if the Nuggets could stick it to him on Christmas Day, that would make
yeah. We
me
always
very
want to beat the
happy.
Suns. Yes.
Both teams involved, whether they win or lose, really give you an idea of their ceiling because all the guys are playing really hard. And I know that we're going to talk about this a little bit later as well, but the NBA is trying to make it so at least these high profile, as they call it, national TV games aren't being played as back to backs or like the second night of a back to back by either team so that teams, players have, adequate rest
yeah.
before them. So at least there aren't like massive like rest disadvantages or anything like that. We saw last year, what was it? The Bucks faced the Celtics, and the Celtics were on that back to back after I think it was after their overtime loss or overtime win against the Wolves, and they traveled to Milwaukee and they were down 50 at halftime. And ESPN had to switch the stream over to just some other game. So I think they're trying to avoid that. But yeah, with these big marquee games, Christmas Day games, especially season openers, like both teams are still maybe trying to find their footing. Like Christmas is around, like you said, still beginning of the season, but we're starting to approach like being in the middle of the season. Teams are basically starting to solidify who they are, and you can get an idea of like how good these teams actually are on both ends of the floor. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, that's a interesting point about this whole schedule broadly is that the NBA is really leaning into trying to not have those scenarios where there's a big matchup everyone wants to watch and one of them was on a back-to-back, so then they're resting a star player. They already had rest rules for stars implemented last season. This is another like scheduling specific strategy that I hope
Yes.
works to
It
create
would be
some
great if
interesting
they
games.
sometimes guys just need to rest. As it turns out, they're not going to put on national TV anyway, you know, then it is what
Yeah.
it is.
And I've always been interested in the NBA trying to figure out how to make their product more engaging. They have so many games, so it's harder to sell the high stakes of some of them, even though the hardcore
Right.
fans get that. How can they attract more of the casual fans? And those are games that they can definitely do that.
But everyone's really excited, I think, about how the national TV games got divvied up this season for the most part. I think the Nuggets actually got around the same number, a little bit fewer. I think teams like the Pacers, the Wolves, got more national TV games by
Hmm.
a substantial number. I know I was listening to um, some of the Wolves guys talking about uh, being really excited about 17 national TV games if you exclude NBA TV. But one of the densest um, stretches of national TV games for the Denver Nuggets comes around right after the All Star break, starting with February 22nd versus the Lakers, the Bucks, Suns, Thunder. And the reason I wanted to point out this stretch is that a lot of people talk about statement week or statement weeks. We had one stretch of, really important games, especially versus the East. Last year in January, we had the game against Philly. There was the Celtics game in Boston that was really big and high profile. Everyone was talking about it afterward. And then there was another statement week I guess you could say, coming out of the All-Star break, where it was a lot more West teams, but they also faced the Celtics again at home in that stretch. I think they faced the Knicks at home also in that stretch. So it's more like a statement fortnight, if you will. And so this stretch here of national TV games kind of covers the equivalent of that second statement week last year, except it's a lot more games. Every single game in this stretch is versus a team that made the playoffs, except they faced Detroit in this
And
stretch. But every other team, oh, and
yeah,
the
and the
Wizards,
Wizards, yeah.
right? But every other team is a playoff team from either conference. It's actually mostly Western Conference teams, high profile. And when you think about the seeding battle in the Western Conference, every single one of these games is going to matter to both teams a lot because every win counts. Every toss-up win, like two good teams, anybody could win, is going to matter a lot for those seeding margins in a conference where I believe there were 3 games separating the 8th seed from the 5th seed. And that's the difference between being in the play-in, obviously. In the case of Dallas, they got out of the play-in and they were able to eventually win the conference. Meanwhile, both play-in teams that came into the playoffs through the play-in lost in the first round, as they should, because they're going to be playing higher seeds.
This stretch is definitely interesting and pretty brutal when I'm looking at it. The Pacers are no slouch, and that's a road
Nope.
game. The Bucks, I don't even like. There are even some teams where I don't know how they'll necessarily look because this is after the All-Star and the trade deadline and all that. So
That's exactly right.
the
And like
Lakers,
last year, the Mavs came out of the trade deadline like the hottest team in the NBA. They
yeah.
were winning games at a ridiculous rate.
And I mean trades and all that
Claw out of that.
we've been talking about the CBA and how, difficult it is to fit these rosters together, and we're still in the early stages of that where I think it may be harder to make splash trades because salaries are harder to like fit together. But you never know, like the Lakers could look different. I mean the Celtics are not going to be different. The Kings maybe not. They kind of already made a trade. Suns potentially could do a deadline deal. I
No,
think I think
they,
OKC is
I mean,
pretty
they
much going to be
could,
the
but
same.
they're in the same position as the Celtics over the second apron.
That's true. But like let's say the Suns are just sucking it up the first half of the season. Do they do something like
Right.
weird? I don't know. OKC I think will look the same. Minnesota will look mostly the same. Golden State, who knows? Like they could be maybe different. You just
And
never
now
know.
that you mentioned Golden State, they're another team that did not make the playoffs last year. So they're
That's
in this
true.
stretch, they're grouped along with Detroit, Sacramento, Golden State, and the Washington Wizards,
Yeah.
right? So I
But
think
yeah,
when we get to the stretch, it's going to be really important for the Warriors and the Kings, especially those
for
games,
the
because it's going to
play-in.
matter a lot for those teams that need to make sure they're not play-in teams 2 years in a row.
Yeah, I would imagine pretty much every team wants to avoid that, especially Steph now, who's, I'm sure he's sick of, getting eliminated in these weird games where anything can happen. So, yeah, you got to like find a way to stay motivated in the West. Every game matters. It's splitting hairs in terms of the record and the seeding for the most part. The season the Nuggets won the title, they were pretty much running away with a 1 seed, but I don't know that we'll see that unless OKC, like they're young and just like stacked. So, I could see them maybe like getting a decent lead on the 1 seed, but we have that weird back to back in Oklahoma City. Only thing I thought about this was despite the fact that it's 2 games on the road against them, we don't have to travel in between. So it's like you travel, you play the game, and then you just go
Right.
back, chill, and then go back and play, which hopefully helps. I think Ryan Blackburn said on his show that the like average seeding of the all the teams we play on the second night of the back to back is like 10, the 10th seed. So it's
Like if you
more,
put Oklahoma City, that'd probably bring it down to like 12,
yeah,
11 or
exactly.
12, right?
I
Because
think
they were the 1 seed.
that this one particular is probably one of the harder teams on a back to back that will be playing all season. I mean, they're the 1 seed, so I'd rather play them than Minnesota on a back to back, I think, because of the matchup, but they're still like a hard team.
I mean,
So,
Malone compared playing Oklahoma City. Every game they play, it's like a root canal, right?
yeah. Well, now it's even
So,
worse. That was like back when we thought they were just like kind of scrappy up and
right.
coming. Now they're seen as like legit.
And they got even scrappier, right? Because you could say a lot of like good things about Josh Giddey, but I don't think scrappy is a word that you would used to describe him necessarily. Not that he
No.
isn't. It's just like if you replaced him with Alex Caruso, the scrappy index has increased
Yeah,
substantially.
for sure.
Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about the schedule is the travel. The Nuggets are traveling roughly 44,000 miles at this point. I was using the calculations made by Positive Residual, which hasn't accounted yet for the 2 games that will be added either in the season tournament knockout rounds or the makeup games that are there for the teams that don't make the knockout rounds. And the reason that I even point that out is that that puts the Nuggets at roughly I think they're in the top third for most miles traveled. They're usually in that top half because they're in the Western Conference, they're in the Northwest Division. The teams in the Northwest Division are particularly spaced out from each other and from the rest of the NBA, so they're going to travel the most miles usually, and there's only like small differences year to year in that. But actually, I looked it up, and last year they traveled a lot more miles, and it was closer to the top of the league overall. We'll see what that looks like when they add in, again, those makeup games. The year that they won the title, they actually traveled the most miles in the NBA. And it wasn't particularly close.
Was that just regular
The
season or did that include
regular
playoffs?
season.
Okay.
Regular season. So that was interesting. So it's like, okay, well, they were still able to win the 1 seed that year, even though it was with only 53 games. And they were fine. They rested the guys down the stretch. So, that probably like they had to travel a lot, but maybe they didn't play as many games, especially like Jokic in particular didn't play as many games. MPJ didn't play as many games as he did last year, that year either. I wanted to bring this up because this is usually the thing that the schedule nerds care the most about when they're comparing, the logistics of different team schedule, who gets the most disadvantage. I think last year that was the Clippers by far. Like it wasn't close, and the Clippers had to travel the most miles in their schedule. And you can imagine that being the case in particular because they were still sharing that arena with the Lakers, and so they just have all kinds of wonky stuff where they can't quite always optimize their schedule for minimizing travel, things like that the league is trying to do to some extent. Now they have their own arena, so they're actually like nowhere near the top in travel, which is interesting. The year that they had the most travel, they were still able to win a lot of regular season games, get the 1 seed in the West,
Yeah.
and win a
Almost
title.
take the last month off, too.
Yeah, exactly.
So you always wonder how travel affects teams. You would imagine it would suck because you're traveling, you're on a plane, you're tired, you're getting in late. But I guess if you have the talent and a good enough team, they're gonna rise to the occasion. I don't know where that ranks total with the other teams.
It's top third, but I think it's around that like 20, not 20th, but I guess like 10th in total
Okay.
travel. The question I had about this that I want to talk to you about, even though I said like, hey, they had the most travel a couple of years ago and they still won the title, but traveling a lot is still not good for you. Like lots of studies have talked about how travel is not good for your health. It can potentially make certain types of athletes more prone to injury with like more travel because of how much it drains your body's like recovery functions, messes with your sleep schedule, all of that
Mm-hmm.
stuff, right? I think that that's pretty intuitive. The Eastern Conference teams were consistently at the bottom of this chart when I was looking back through a couple of seasons. The 2 teams that were always like bottom 3, I guess, in miles travel were like the Cleveland Cavaliers and the Toronto Raptors. The Raptors are like always right there because all those teams in their division are like right next to each other in the
Yeah.
Northeast, right? It's interesting that Toronto's there instead of one of the other teams in that division because they're even closer to each
Yeah,
other.
they're super close.
I wanted to ask, like, do you think that the East has yet another systemic advantage due to this thing with all these teams' proximity that makes it so they don't have to travel as much as the West teams and just makes their lives even easier than it already is because they're in the Eastern Conference?
It's a really interesting point. I don't actually know what like the data says about traveling and how that affects like win totals season to season. I'm sure there's
Yeah.
experts out there who know that. Like if Matt was here, he'd probably know.
Right.
Well, the thing is it's weird because it's like you'd say the East is always kind of worse. Like there's worse teams. So if they have to travel less, shouldn't they be able to consistently put a better product on
You'd
the
think
court?
so,
But
but it actually works in favor of my anti-East agenda because it's like, you have this advantage. Why aren't you better?
yeah, well, maybe that just makes it like the teams that are good
Yeah.
really separate themselves from the East teams that are bad. So
Yeah.
if you're ever gonna have an upset on a top East team if you're like middle of the pack or lower in the East with like you have a home game and they travel and they're tired. You just have less of an advantage there because they're just not traveling as much. Like they just flew to Detroit from Philly rather than, across the country into multiple different
True.
time zones.
It might be why Western Conference road trips are so brutal for Eastern Conference teams too, because
Like the
you're
one
obviously
time.
traveling, you're playing not at home like you would on any kind of road trip, but you're traveling even more than you do on road trips within your conference. Whereas for Western Conference teams, traveling east is like difficult, of course, but they're used to traveling longer distances because they travel to other Western Conference teams that are already like pretty far apart from each other just
Yeah.
because of geographically, like the West is very spaced out. We've got the
Mm-hmm.
Great Plains, we've got the Rocky Mountains, we've got lots of other mountain ranges as well.
You gotta go down to
It's the
Texas, going over to the
Western Front, right?
northwest.
All this unexplored territory. And it actually, while we're on this, I'll just like skip down to another question that I had. The NBA is trying to expand eventually once they like final out this media rights deal and finish this lawsuit or whatever legal action with TNT. And all of the teams that have been discussed for this for expansion seriously anyway are in the West. They've talked about Seattle because they want to make up for taking away the Seattle Supersonics. Las Vegas seems like the only lock for sure, although I think Seattle like has it. Mexico City has been discussed as well. They're all in the West, and so it would be the West gaining two teams, and then another Western Conference team would move. When you think about this travel aspect, it's actually not that like it's not that logistically sound to add both of the expansion teams to the Western Conference. But the other consideration is obviously like balance between the conferences, and I think that the Western Conference could definitely use a couple more tanking teams just
Mm-hmm.
just to make up for that. But yeah, what are your thoughts on just that aspect with expansion and what it would mean for more it would be more travel not just for other Western Conference teams that have to play these new teams that are going to join the West, but also the East that will have to travel to either Seattle or Vegas is more central, so I think that's probably why it's like the safe choice also. But I think Mexico City would be a dope expansion team
Mm.
personally, but it's also it'd be the furthest away of any of them.
So you're saying it would be logistically sound to add a team to the East just because it's easier travel on everyone on the whole?
Yeah.
But I also like I'd rather go the balanced route. Like if they added Seattle or
Hmm.
Vegas, it's easier for like the Suns to travel there, or California teams to travel to Vegas, and it's easier for Portland to go to Seattle, maybe easier for Sacramento to go to Seattle. Like there's some wiggle room there. It's not as easy as the compactness of the East necessarily, but I don't think the NBA is going to care about that. They're going to go for the market.
No, I don't think so
Yeah.
either. They're for the money. Yeah.
Yeah, they're gonna go for Vegas or the Sonics or whatever.
Or
So, and
both.
that just happens to be in the West, which I'm happy about. And then they will just move one team to the East, which there are some teams.
Minnesota.
Yeah, there are some teams you could argue it's either Memphis or Minnesota. I would say would move to the
Yeah.
East. I guess Tennessee's or Memphis probably closer geographically. So logistically,
They're pretty close.
yeah.
They're pretty close
But
actually, but I think it is Memphis.
that's a little more stretched out than they currently are. So that just adds a little more travel around the east, which I think is more, fair.
Yeah, I guess then you balance out the travel between the conferences too if they have to travel a little bit further for like one more team that's in the
Yeah,
conference.
like if they put it in Minnesota, I think that would make sense and would stretch them out a little bit. But I don't know. The reality is that traveling in the NBA and putting on a league like this is just tough. It's tough to schedule it. It's tough to travel. There's a lot of games. People already want less games.
Yeah,
So it's just a
that's
reality
true.
of the situation. And it seems like, for the most part, unless I miss some fan bases, people seem generally happy about their schedules. I don't know. I haven't looked around. Nuggets fans,
I
I
haven't
think.
seen anyone unhappy about their
Yeah, I
schedule,
guess that's a better way to
let's
phrase
say,
it.
which is different than last year where I heard a lot of complaining from a lot of different teams, including or like fans of different teams, including the Nuggets, about their schedule last year, in particular because of how back-to-back and, like, second nights of back-to-back heavy it was early on in the season.
Hmm.
So even though they have more back-to-backs this year, and we'll dig into that a little bit more, it seems like it's more evenly distributed across the season, and like you said, the back-to-backs are versus, sort of lighter competition
Yeah, I
than
hope.
they seemed to be last year, but
Yeah.
okay, so I wanted to bring up the 3 biggest home stretches in the schedule. So the first one is at the beginning, starting with November 2nd. There are 5 games starting with the Jazz that are in Denver just in a row. That's a beautiful stretch of at home, win these games. There's another game versus Oklahoma City, so it's interesting. We have OKC kind of twice within about a 2-week span, and then we don't play them again until March, right? Both of those games are at home. We want to try to win those, get our division tiebreakers out of the way if we can. But this is an interesting stretch, I think, because you've got 2 teams that you should definitely beat in the Jazz and the Raptors that are probably gonna be tanking. You never know with the Jazz. And then you have 3 playoff teams in Oklahoma City, the Heat, and Dallas Mavericks, which are obviously a great team. They won the Western Conference in the playoffs last year, but they're all at home. So it's just a good stretch to start to build your cushion early in the season. The next stretch, which actually ties this one, is toward the end of the season on March 24th. We have Chicago, which should win that game. The Bucks, which is kind of a 50-50 because we don't know how Milwaukee is actually going to be next year, but we tend to do well against the Bucks at home. The Jazz again, Minnesota, which is going to be a toss up. Like those teams are just, it's a tough matchup. Both teams play really hard. They're both really good. And then San Antonio, which, we've seen how hard Wemby plays versus good players. He definitely takes the Jokic matchup very seriously, but these are all games again that you should win. So you have this opportunity at the beginning of the season, at the end of the season to go on these mini runs to try to run up your win total. Maybe at the beginning of the season, it's about building a cushion for what's going to go on in the middle with more road heavy schedules. At the end of the season or toward the end of the season, it's an opportunity to maybe go on like one final stretch run of like play hard, win these games, and maybe let the chips fall where they may with the last few games of the season that are kind of home and road, so that they can decide to just get some rest, but put themselves in a position to get the best seed that they can that's like reasonable. Before I go to the last stretch of home games, what do you think about that kind of framework of those 2 stretches at the beginning and the end, just like building cushion versus like, okay, let's try to run it up at the end before we go on a little bit of rest. Like that's how I would be looking at it if I were like on the coaching staff trying to recommend like a way to like a rhythm to the season. Like that's what I would say about those stretches.
Yeah, I think it's important to identify stretches like that. Schedules are always like this, where you have stretches that are more in your favor and stretches that are more difficult. And we talked about the kind of difficult, kind of compact stretch. And it's important to keep that context as a fan, because sometimes you're just not going to be winning those games. And sometimes you're going to go on stretches, and you don't want to necessarily overestimate how a team is playing when they're on an easy
Right.
stretch. And you don't want to, act like the world is falling when a bad stretch is happening. And I
Right.
do think
Right.
I'm not, there are clear signs of this during the season with every team, where you can look at their schedule and be like, damn, they didn't really play anybody, or wow, they had a brutal stretch of games right there, and that's why they're playing bad, and they're going to bounce back and play better at the end of the season or whatever. I think like that's a legitimate real thing. As someone who, I kind of don't care as much about the nuances of scheduling, because I'm just like, every game is the game, and like I hope you win. Except for back to backs, I kind of care more about that. These things are real. So I like
Yeah.
pointing out these things, especially the end, because the end of season stretch last year kind of screwed us. So I want to at least get the 3 seed. That's like kind of where I sit. So we'll see how the Nuggets, where they're at coming into like the last month, and hopefully are in a good spot to where they don't have to push super hard for like a at least top 3 seed.
So there's this nice stretch here before and after the All-Star break, actually, where leading up to the All-Star break, the only road game we have is versus Phoenix. And then coming out of the All-Star break, it is 4 home games in a row versus all teams that we should beat, especially at home, in the Blazers twice, Charlotte, and then the Lakers. Yeah, these are the kind of stretches, like you said, that, the teams are going to be playing like a little bit differently at different stretches in the season, unless you're the Boston Celtics, where you're just at any given point winning 75% of your games, regardless of like what stretch of the season it's in. If you're in the Western Conference, you really want to take these stretches of home games, if you're a good home team like the Nuggets are, seriously, because you can really build up either a cushion for like a bad stretch, like I said, or a lead that you could use to rest guys down the stretch of the season later. So in these stretches of like 5 games at home versus, teams that you should beat for the most part, and maybe there's like 1 or 2 tough matchups in there, I think it's reasonable to want the team to go either 5-0 or 4-1. Want that / expect it. If your expectation is like, we're trying to build a cushion or like run it up, like this, you have to go beyond your normal sort of win percentage that you would, your pace that you were at for most of the season, right? Whereas during the road stretches, which we are going to talk about, actually, we could go to the longest road trip now, which is not that long. If you go to January 25th, starting at Minnesota, we have a 5-game road trip, which is the longest road trip on the entire schedule, which is pretty sweet. I think they had something like a 7-game road trip was the longest last season. And it's not uncommon, I think, or wasn't uncommon last season for East Coast road trips or Eastern Conference road trips for Western Conference teams to be like 7 games, just because that is more convenient for travel. If you could pack them in these like longer chunks, then you don't have to like keep flying back and forth between the coasts. But in this case, it starts with Minnesota. Maybe that is a signal that Minnesota is going to be the team moving to the Eastern Conference. If they see that this is like the most convenient, way for travel to go. Then we get to Chicago, at New York, at Philly, at Charlotte. One of the things that I noted during this schedule stretch is that this game at Philadelphia is actually the second matchup versus Philly this year. I believe last season and the season before, the series against Philly started with Denver at Philly, and then the game in Denver doesn't happen until afterward. And we know sort of what that means for the dynamic of, Jokic goes to Philly, they lose a game in Philadelphia, Joel gets to brag about it. Joel then doesn't play in Denver, and then that's a thing too. But that's a difficult stretch of games, actually, because you only have 2 games against teams that you should beat, and they're also on the road, right? Versus Chicago and Charlotte. But then the other 3 are Minnesota, always tough. New York, always tough. Philadelphia, always tough, right? And so that's a road trip where I'm like, I'd be happy with 3-2. Like, take those 2 for sure against Chicago and Charlotte, and then one of the 3 versus mini. Ideally, it'd be mini, because you get the division and the conference adds to the division and conference tiebreakers. But if you can get one of the ones versus New York or Philly instead, that'd be fine. And anything above that is cake. So sort of setting expectations for these different stretches of the season, like reasonable expectations. This isn't about saying like the Nuggets, they would never win these games because they're on the road and they're versus these like super tough Eastern Conference teams. Like they can absolutely win basically every game they play, but they probably won't. Right. And so that's just like, that's how I'm thinking about these different stretches of the season.
Yeah.
So the last like nitpicky thing before we talk about tiebreakers that I wanted to point out was actually that OKC back-to-back. It's actually one of 6 baseball series that the Nuggets have this season, where they have 2 games in a row versus the same team, called a baseball series, because baseball does this all the time. Will has the word baseball muted on his Twitter, so I don't know that you either know that or care about that at all. But it's one of the things that baseball tries to do to reduce travel. Often they're in the same place. In the case of this OKC game, that one's in the same place. So Will is showing here, it's the case with Dallas, both in Dallas. We actually only have one of these baseball series that is in 2 different places. It is the one versus the San Antonio. Oh no, we have 2, because there's the one versus the Spurs that's home in Denver and then on the road in San Antonio. And then the other one versus the Suns in December, where we have, are those 2 in a row? One. They are. So again, at home and then on the road. The other ones are going to be in the same place.
Yeah, like we go
Um,
Memphis one in November, both
exactly.
away with the day in between. So they're gonna get some good time in Memphis.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on these baseball series. This isn't the first year they've done them. We had, to my recollection, one baseball series last season that I can remember that was versus the Blazers, and it was both games were in Denver. And then I remember there were these two like big national, one of them was a national TV game, but it was the Spurs at Phoenix, and the Spurs won both of those games. It was early in the season. Everyone's like, "Oh my God, Wemby," and everyone was like, "Oh my God, Phoenix," going on. And it was so funny that I want to point out the Spurs versus Suns one in particular because in the first game, the Suns were out to this giant lead. They let it dwindle. Then the Spurs beat them in the clutch. In the second game, the Spurs got out to a massive lead, like 30 points at half, and then they let it dwindle, and then they were able to hang on in the clutch. But I was like, oh, did like the Suns make adjustments between these two games since they're playing the same team back to back? It's kind of relevant for two teams in Denver and OKC that are going to play each other in the last two games of their season series. They're in the same division. They're teams that could meet each other in the playoffs. Do you think that these baseball series are going to provide more opportunities for coaches and teams to try out different adjustments, try out different, lineups, rotations, whatever it is, or it's just going to be like any two regular season games in a row?
Yeah, that's my big question. I think early on in the season against, non-playoff teams like Pelicans and in January the Spurs, I think less of that
Yeah.
will happen. But like against the Dallas or like Memphis, I think you should probably try to suss them out a little bit because we don't. I think we all expect they're going to be good, but we don't really know what they're like right now. I'm not an NBA coach. I don't know how Malone views like showing your hand versus just playing your base offense and defense.
I think that Malone tries out very specific things in particular matchups. Like we saw one that stands out a lot to me was the game in Boston versus Boston last year, where he went to a 7.5 man rotation
Yeah,
with
that one.
AG, and he switched up who like some of the matchups, like did some cross matching on defense, particularly in the second half of that game and that kind of thing. And the same thing with the game in Denver, although it wasn't as tight a rotation, but change up some of the defensive scheme in that game. So I think that he's willing to do it for particular matchups
Yeah,
and maybe not others.
I think yeah, throwing something at them just to see how they play it. And granted, they could
Mm.
completely switch up
Right. Like you're
assignments.
also information gathering, and sometimes to do that, you have to show your hand a little bit.
Yeah, and maybe like the defensive assignments, they like maybe Jason Tatum isn't playing, a specific matchup in the regular season against us, but in the playoffs they'll put him somewhere to like confuse the coverages. That could happen because Tatum's very like versatile on defense, and that's like what screwed the
Yeah.
Mavs
That's
essentially.
something the Celtics also did, right? So the adjustment that they made in the finals versus the Mavs, where they put Tatum on the center,
Yeah.
or were willing to switch Tatum onto the center, or like had him on Jamal, or maybe they had him on Luca or had him on Lively to try to stifle the pick and roll. They actually did that in the game in Denver as well. So
Mm-hmm.
like some of these teams are willing to do things a little bit differently in certain matchups in certain moments for sure. So there are definitely interesting. You could even say with OKC, that game that came down to the wire and that they were able to pull off in Denver. Dagnault went to a double big lineup in the second half of that game. He benched Giddy and had big Jalen Williams starting in that spot or in within the lineup so that they had Chet and big J Will on the floor at the same time. That was something they didn't do in that first matchup that they had in the season, but it was difficult to necessarily tell the progression because like months had passed between those games. Whereas here, in the case of a baseball series, you'll be able to see adjustments game to game pretty clearly, just because it'll be like fresher in your mind.
I think Malone is always balancing trying to win the next game. He always says, like, as a head coach, you're just trying to win the next game. They learned this lesson that maybe they shouldn't have pushed for the one seed, or at least that's what they said. Are they gonna
Yeah, they said a
like?
lot of things. They also
Yeah,
said that down the stretch of the season, and did
Yeah, exactly.
otherwise.
Like we're not going to care about the one seed. It's health. But then after the season, everyone was like, "Yeah, we are pushing for the one seed." It's like the regular season almost matters less because you want to just focus on being healthy for the playoffs. But you kind of can be healthy for the playoffs if you take the regular season seriously. So it's like it's
Especially
weird.
early on. Exactly.
The Nuggets have different lineup this year. We've talked about them wanting to maybe be more versatile on offense. I don't think they should be afraid to show some stuff if it means winning more games. I think also like the Nuggets have played the Suns in the playoffs before. The KD Suns, they're different now with Beal. We haven't played them, but I'm not that worried about them. OKC
Yeah.
Thunder is a different story. We haven't played them in the playoffs. We played the Wolves multiple times. Thunder and Wolves are like the two teams I'm most worried about. So I think there's less concern of like showing your hand versus the Wolves because like these teams have played each other in the playoffs a lot.
Oh
I
my
think I
God.
think we kind of
Yeah, they've
know.
played 12
Yeah,
games against each other in a playoff setting
I think
in the
that
last
you
couple of years,
because
plus
that
every regular season game. They play each other 4 times every year.
yeah, you want to see Mike and Jamal do well against the Wolves, so try to do some stuff to set them up. But then does that show the Wolves ways to counter it?
Look, we talked about in like during that playoff series, the Wolves ball pressure is going to crumble. The question was when are the Nuggets going to start doing the things that they need to do to take advantage of it? We finally started to see them do that in that game 3. They had 3-game winning streak against the Wolves. Finally in game 6, the Wolves ditch the ball pressure or they
They're like
don't ditch
full
it, but they
court
start
shit.
to be way more selective about it with when, where, which matchups, right? Keeping it on Jamal, but basically not doing it on anybody else because you shouldn't,
Hmm.
for all the reasons that we talked about. But yeah, like you said, all of the like adjustments that each team is going to make or can make, they have, and it's more about. I think it's so much more about execution now
Yeah, yeah, and just
than
being healthy
scheme.
and
Like, and part of that is like, okay, when is it time to move to the new scheme? But it's not about like, oh, we need to come up with a whole new like creative thing, like way to like counter this like revolutionary concept of like figuring out someone that your rim protector can roam off of. It's like, okay, there are specific things that you can do to counter this. Now it's about everyone on the floor working to execute that, right? I just wanted to just give a couple of little notes about the games versus our division rivals. 3 main things here. The first is that there are no division rivals in our IST group. Part of that is because they were the top 3 seeds in the West in the case of Minnesota, Denver, and OKC. So that means they wouldn't be in the same IST group. Obviously, there was a chance that Utah or Portland could also be there, but they just weren't. They were in the other groups. So that means that there's no possibility that we play any of our division rivals 5 times, the 4 times that are normal, plus the makeup game potentially, right? We don't know which teams are going to play on the makeup game, but it's not going to be a division team because they're not in our IST group. The next thing is that all 4 games versus the Minnesota Timberwolves are on national TV. NBA is really trying to play up this rivalry. I think that's significant because they obviously played a very strange yet competitive, in some ways, not competitive in others, playoff series this past year, and they played a competitive-ish in other ways playoff series the year before. Close gentleman's sweep, as one would say. The fact that those are going to be on national TV, I think, matters a lot because Ant likes the spotlight. Jamal likes the spotlight. The Nuggets take those games. They tend to take those games very seriously, right? We had lots of big marquee moments on those prime time games from the Nuggets last year versus Boston. Both times they had, Jokic's game winner in the big comeback versus Golden State, of course. Every Lakers game, because I think every Lakers game is on national TV. It seems every Nuggets Lakers game. The Timberwolves are a very confident young team, so they're going to be playing, I think, especially hard in those national TV games, especially because they're a team that saw a big spike in their national TV games this season, like we said. So they're going to want to really show out and like show that like they deserve
hmm
these and they deserve even more than they got. The last bullet point I have here is just that the Nuggets only have 2 back-to-backs against any team in the division. So, like you said, even for people that don't necessarily care about the schedule like yourself, you care enough that like on a back-to-back, you're willing to give them generally a pass unless they're like just,
or
you know,
unless you're Tim
losing to
Legler.
teams that or unless you're Tim Leckler. Right. Those 2 back-to-backs are the one versus OKC that we talked about, that's part of that baseball series in Oklahoma City, and the other one is versus the Jazz at home, and I think it's one of the November games.
In the meantime, like, subscribe, and share. Hit the notification bell. Leave us a review on whatever platform you are listening on or watching. And follow us on Instagram and TikTok. We'll still try to be putting shorts up when we can. And check out our new Clips channel on What's in a Game NBA Clips. And remember, winning is fun and losing sucks.